Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be taking a look at some advanced salary cap analytics for the Jacksonville Jaguars that I've put together here. Going to be kind of overviewing how this looks for the offseason. Is this team in a good place to spend? And just kind of breaking that down, along with maybe some of the decisions they might consider heading into free agency, which is surprisingly only like 3 weeks away at this point, or just over that. We're getting really close now. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. And it's going to start by just explaining what all these numbers mean here. I do not look at the salary cap the same way that most people do. For me, it is rather than just about purely cap hits. It is about, it's essentially a comparison to me of what is the NFL giving you to spend, which is your salary cap for the season. So right now, this is the low estimate, $277.5 million. But you compare that to what is the average cost of each player that you have on your roster on this part of the contract. And when you do that, you're essentially comparing what are you really paying these players right now, what is their value to you, compared to what are you being given to spend. Because when we just look at cap hits, things get very, what's the right word here? Very diluted. I'll use that, right? It's not really a good way of looking at it, and it can lead to you making some poor decisions because it's not really including all the context, right? For example, when people just look at the salary cap and they see, oh, Christian Kirk, $24 million this year. He's not worth $24 million. Why are we paying him that? Let's cut him. Well, part of that money is prorated bonuses from years before. It's money that you push down the road. And his actual value and what he's slated to earn this year isn't $24 million. It's actually $16.5 million. So we could take a look at that here with Christian Kirk, where you look at these numbers. This is your prorated bonus. So this is basically signing bonuses from previous years that have been put onto the cap this year. You can't change that. Can't move that down the road. That is just there to stay. And then what you also have, and this is really where the value of a player comes in, is the base salary. So that's $15.5 million. And then the non-prorated bonus. So this is $1 million this season. So when you look at this, you want to add up this number and this number, essentially. You want to consider guarantees, of which Christian Kirk has none left at this point. And what you come out to the conclusion of is that this year, he is going to earn $16.5 million. So now it's a question, instead of this $24 million cap number, which a little bit off from what I have here, not a huge deal there. But it's not really a question of if he's worth $24 million. It's really, is Christian Kirk worth $16.5 million, right? And you also want to avoid sitting here and looking at just the cap savings. It's another thing, because people might get on this website, which is used by a lot of people. They might just click submit and say, okay, if I cut him, I'm saving this amount. That is not really the only context here, because you're also saving money down the road, because you're eventually, if you don't cut him, going to run into these void cap year cap hits. So you can see this number right up here. When you add this all together, then you get to the point where it's like, okay, I am saving $16.5 million. So this is some of the context we try to bring into this. Now, if you're not a numbers guy, totally understand if you don't watch this super close. I know that's not for everyone. I personally am. And I like to at least try to provide some context to this every offseason, so you guys can have another way of looking at this and trying to be maybe a little more educated from what you normally hear, just a different opinion, right? Not necessarily the only one, but just something else to consider when looking at these numbers. Now, as far as where the Jaguars sit for the context of what I first brought up, which is what is the average value of each player on this roster, on this part of their contract, compared to what you're being given right now. So these are your total costs here. This is the combination of all of these numbers, which is his average per year. And so for most of these, it's pretty straightforward. You also get some that may be a little bit confusing. So Trevor Lawrence, for example, Yes, he is a $55 million a year quarterback, but this would be his 5th year in the NFL. And what was agreed upon for the Jaguars and Trevor Lawrence when they they gave him the 5th year option was that this year, his 5th year option would set a value for him of $25 million, and then this extra change you see. Now, when the Jaguars extend him, that pushes cap hits all around and moves money forward. He may get paid stuff early, but ultimately, he is not really being valued at $55 million a year by this team until 2026. So that's why you get a number like this. So there's context you have to include when looking into all of this. But ultimately, this is what's important, right? This is your average cost of all the players combined. This is including all these players. This is also including your rookie pool, which is currently 10 players. And this is going to add on about $20 million a year for this team as far as their spending. And then you're also going to have some other things such as you might want to consider the practice squad, which I don't have listed on here right now, would add on like at least $4 million a year. When you have 17 or so players, they make like $225,000 a year at least. So that's how you get to that sort of number. But ultimately, where the Jaguars sit, if they did absolutely nothing this offseason except make their draft picks, they would be spending pretty much exactly what the league has given them. Maybe overspending by a couple million, no big deal. So that's where they currently sit. Other context to include, which just really tells you how healthy is the cap down the road, how much of the Jaguars have been pushing things into the future, is this column here. So this is your cap hit push to 2026 and beyond. So this would essentially be the amount of money that you'll see against the cap starting in 2026 and future years that is ultimately for play that these players had in 2025 and even before then. So as of now, if the Jaguars made no moves, they have pushed $146 million down the road, which in 2026, you look at what the salary cap might be that year, just the number I have currently, that is half of what you are given to spend that. So it's a considerable amount of money. Now, is this necessarily a New Orleans Saints situation? No. The Jaguars, because of this, also have a lot of cap space available. Currently, right now I have them slated around $48 million. You're going to see a lot of different numbers, and there's context for that. But ultimately, the Jaguars do have a lot of money to spend at the moment. But instead of just saying, hey, we got to spend $48 million, and you're prorating all these contracts, and you're having these low cap hits this year, you got to have context of how much is this really costing the team? Are we in the situation right now where we need to be going all in? We need to be spending way over the cap. And I personally don't think they should. I think that you want to wait until you are in the playoffs and you're competing at that level instead of trying to go from 5th worst team to we're going to spend like crazy. We've seen how that's worked for this team. They made a wild card appearance. They won that game, and they went straight back to hell after. A lot of other problems too, but that's ultimately how that ended. So that's where you sit right now. There are certain players we'll talk about here that the Jaguars could look to cut this year. So those are the guys we have highlighted in yellow. You have Christian Kirk, you have Evan Ingram, Devon Hamilton, Mitch Morse, Devin Duvernay, Andrew Wingard, and Logan Cook. And there might be some others you could throw in here, like Ronald Darby is another one we'll actually talk about. Some of these guys is different context for, because a lot of these players, especially like basically these three right here, Morse, Darby, and Duvernay, they have some guarantees left on their contract to where you have to consider that even though they may have a value of say $5 million a year for Mitch Morse, he's not really a question of if he's worth $5 million, because you're already in for spending some of that money because of guarantees. Unless you find a trade partner, and you got to ask yourself, is it realistic for certain players that we find trade partners? So we'll start with Christian Kirk, right? We'll go back to what we talked about. This will be a quick one because, well, we kind of gave context to this already. $24 million cap hit, but right now he is slated to earn $16.5 million this year, which is completely unguaranteed. There's no guaranteed money on that. The Jaguars could cut him, move on. They would save that much, even if not against the cap this year, because you'll see this is what you save. Some of that money gets saved in 2026, 2027, years like that, because those are years you have void cap hits, or you might have just prorated down the line on a contract. So that's your context that you got to consider. So as far as Christian Kirk, do I think the Jaguars should move on? I think this is, I'll keep it simple, right? If he is going to say, this is the value we agreed to, this is how much I need to earn, and there is going to be no questions about it, I'm not going to do anything except for just restructure, which restructure in this case would be maybe just taking a signing bonus. You're still earning the same amount, but you're just helping them fix the cap to where maybe some of that $16.5 million gets pushed down the road. And what that might look like will be something like this. So you have the minimum base salary that you can set. This all gets pushed down the road in prorated bonuses. Now the cap hit's smaller. But you also got to pay him more money 2026, 2027. So that could be an option, right? But even if you restructure, and how nice that sounds, if you did that without telling him to take a pay cut, you're still paying him $16.5 million. And you have to ask, is that a financially responsible decision for the Jaguars? Now, if Christian Kirk comes back and he plays at full speed and he has a great year and he plays like, say he did in 2022 or was on track to in 2023 before he was hurt, that could be worth it, right? Especially with the wide receiver market being as crazy as it is now, where it's really taken a big leap. So that could be worth it. The problem is that you have 2 years in a row that Christian Kirk has suffered season-ending injuries. And when that happens, this should not really be under consideration to have a player come back at that predetermined amount without changing that, without making it more beneficial to the team, because there's more risk involved, right? You have a lot of injuries you're now dealing with for Christian Kirk. So for me, if this doesn't change and he just says, I'll restructure, but I'm not taking a pay cut, because sometimes restructures can include that, sometimes they don't. If he says he doesn't want to take a pay cut, I'm not keeping, because it's too much of a risk. And I think there are other options out there. Maybe that could make more sense, right? Maybe say Cooper Kupp, for example. You might think, first of all, if you just go look at the cap hit for him, oh, he's earning like $20 million this year. Well, he's not going to for the next team, because some of that's going to get paid by the Rams. And even if they trade him, you're probably on the hook for like half of what you're paying Christian Kirk. Maybe a little bit more. You get someone who's familiar with Liam Cohen, someone who's also been a pretty good run blocker throughout his career, and has still been very productive. And if you hit on that, maybe that's better spending than what Christian Kirk is. But to keep Christian Kirk around, it's ultimately a question of what's the number going to be, right? Can we get it down to, say, half of what it is right now? Can it get down under $10 million? And if it can, I'm more open to that idea, because then I think you have the ceiling of getting some value out of that beyond what you would usually get for, say, $9 or $10 million, whatever it ends up being. So that's the big question there. I think that one's very much up in the air, but it does sound like, well, Jacksonville's trying to work something out. Well, Trevor Lawrence wants him back. It's probably not going to happen, but we'll have to see what happens, because that is still up in the air. Now, talking about Evan Ingram here for a second. His situation is kind of interesting, the way his contract was structured, because he's essentially earned, well, it says this $13.75 million APY, he's actually earned $1 million less each of these years. And that's pushed $2 million extra dollars that are unguaranteed down the road to this season. So instead of a question of, is he worth about the $14 million you see here, it's closer to $16 million. And you could save this whole amount cutting Evan Ingram. So if we were to do that, you're going to see, once again, like Christian Kirk's contract, you're not going to see the cap savings match the whole amount you're saving, because you have void years down the road, right? Because you're getting out of 2026, you're getting out of 2027, and even 2028 with him. If you keep him on right now, and you have him on the team this season, well, you're going to spend that nearly $6 million more, but then in 2026, you're going to have $4 million, which shows 9.5. This is the sum of 26 through 28. But that's how much more money you're going to be spending on him, and it's just going to come in the form of void years. So the question for Evan Ingram is going to be, is he worth this nearly $16 million cap amount? Now, it also goes further, right? And we had a whole video on this where we talked about what kind of tight ends that Liam Cohen has used throughout his career. Keep in mind, Liam Cohen may be someone who just has not been in the situation to have a player like Evan Ingram and says, hey, we'll change how we've done things. We're going to get this guy heavily involved in the receiving game. We're going to set up the offense to where it works to his strengths, and that's going to work out great for us. If they do that, totally understand it. But generally, Liam Cohen has asked his players to do a lot of blocking from the tight end position. And while Evan Ingram brings a lot of juice to that, and he definitely puts in effort, he's not built for it, right? He's a receiving tight end. And so you're not going to get the level of play you want out of him. And if you're taking out a bunch of those receiving snaps that he's been taking, his value is going down a lot. So looking at, say the tight end contract table here, what are they getting paid? Who's the highest paid? Travis Kelce, I know he's up in the air right now. He's not really worth $17 million at this point in his career. But ultimately, if you remove him, because he might be retiring here, there might only be one player in the NFL who is earning more on average per year, and that would be TJ Hawkinson from the Minnesota Vikings. So you're essentially having a question of, would you pay Evan Ingram the most money at the position in the league? Because you're about there, right? You're less than $1 million short of what Hawkinson is earning. And when you get to that question, I would be comfortable saying yes if he was in the exact role that he would succeed in. He's best in. I'm not saying he couldn't be good still if he's heavily involved as a blocking tight end. I think he can do that to some extent. But you're not utilizing the player in the best way that you can. And because of that, that would be a player that I would probably look towards trying to trade, trying to work something out. And once again, if Liam Cohen decides, hey, we're going to just keep having him heavily involved as the receiving tight end, then that argument goes out the window. It's really just an unknown at this point. And we're just going off of what did he do with the Rams and what did he do with the Buccaneers. When you go back and look at those years, it's a lot more split than it has been in Jacksonville for Evan Ingram. You also consider Brennan Strange, while not as good of a player as Evan Ingram, is a lot better of a fit, as well to what Liam Cohen's offense has been with the Rams and Bucs. So that's also something to consider here because you do have an in-house solution already. Now, Devon Hamilton. Honestly, this is a really wild one, and this is what we would call a bulky disaster class as far as setting up a player's contract and being able to have options to get out of it. Essentially, the way this is set up, they paid him so much money up front that they pretty much made it impossible to move off of him early. And so you look at these numbers, it's kind of confusing here, right? But they paid him a year early in 2023. And you look at 2025 and 2026 here, which are the years remaining. What we want to pay attention to is the base salary and then your bonuses as well. So if you look at this and you add up these numbers, this doesn't add up to this $11.5 million a year because some of that has been paid way ahead of time. So you're already in for a lot of the money that he would have earned this year. So it's a question, ultimately, when we look at it back here, you have to compare the base salary with the non-prorated bonus. This is $7.3 million. You're on the hook for $3 million more already because this is the guaranteed money left. So ultimately, you have to ask yourself, is Devon Hamilton worth $4.3 million? Because so much money is already been basically guaranteed because it's been paid out early on his contract. This was a really poor contract situation that Trent Baalke set up with Devon Hamilton, it doesn't really give you the option to move out of it early. So that's what we got to look at here. Now, you'll see, because of how wildly bad this contract is set up, if you were to just cut him pre-June 1st, you actually lose cap space this year. Now, while you lose cap space, this does not mean that you are spending more money. You're actually spending less because there is money you would get off the table on, which is that 4.3 something million we're talking about here, which is these two numbers minus this. So the question is he worth 4.3 million? And I think that's actually pretty debatable. Devon Hamilton has had moments, but hasn't really been that great of a player for Jacksonville since he got the extension. He immediately had the off-field injury stuff that was all kind of confusing and actually feared for his life at one point, I believe. It's a wild situation with Devon Hamilton. And so you have to ask, is he going to be able to get to form? And is that going to be worth this amount of money? Now, 4.3 million, it's a lot less than what they valued him at per year, but he's just not lived up to that amount. So it's a real legit question here, and I think I could go both ways as far as what you do with Devon Hamilton. Now, if you want to save money, you can still do that. You can cut him post June 1st. That's going to save you $4.2 million. Here's the problem, though. You go to 2026, now you have an $8.5 million cap number for a player who's not on the team. So that's the flip side, right? That's what comes with cutting players post June 1st, is you're going to also have a cap hit the next year as well, which could be pretty big. So, context there, right? But Devon Hamilton, this is another one like Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram that I think is very debatable, right? And not debatable for good reasons per se, but just because you have a contract where so much money has already essentially been guaranteed to the player that you can't get out of much at this point. So is he going to be worth what is left to be paid out to him that is not guaranteed? And I think it really is debatable. And maybe it comes down to keeping him around until after free agency, after the draft. And then if you get a better player, or, say the Jaguars, they go in on this defensive line class, maybe you're saying, okay, well, Devon Hamilton, you're not going to play much for us anyway. Let's move on from him. So that could be where this ultimately ends up. Now, we're going to move through the rest of these. Mitch Morse, he's an interesting one, like Darby and Duvernay, because some of this money is already guaranteed. So we'll actually look, we'll go over this other tab. I'll show you again later. This is essentially the amount of money for each of these players that you're already on the hook for as far as what they're being paid per year. So if you subtract this 2.1 million from, the 5.2, it's a question of Mitch Morse being worth $3 million for this team. Now, if you could trade him, you're getting out of more money as well. But ultimately, I think this is a very debatable one once again. If you get a player who can come in and start over Mitch Morse, right? If you go get, like, say, Drew Dalman in free agency, or you like a Marcus Mbow in the draft and you feel like he can start right off the bat at center, maybe you try to save that money. But if you don't get a solution here, why move off the contract, right? He can be okay for you for a year. You're really only going to save $3 million moving on from him, so you might as well keep a player like that. Now, Ronald Darby, going back to his, I actually don't have him listed here. He was a late addition, but a lot of his money is already guaranteed. We'll take a look at what the cap hits would look like. He would save you 2.3 this season, or closer to 2.4. And then the next year, I don't know if he's on for any void years. We'll just open this up and take a look real quick. Yeah, so he has no void years. So this one's actually pretty simple because Trent Baalke has not thrown on like 5 void years to the contract. So it's a question of, is Ronald Darby worth this figure right here? Because this is how much you could save. There's no 2026 cap hits or anything with him. So I think this is not much to ask for. The problem is that if you're already adding to cornerback and Monteric Brown's going to be a backup for you, he overtook the job from Ronald Darby this year. So do you keep a player like that on your team, knowing that he's not even going to be your first backup in an ideal world. And just for that sake, I'd probably just move on from him in that case. So that's where I'd be on Ronald Darby, but it's not really a huge deal. You're not saving a ton. Because you got to keep in mind, well, this is 2.4. To replace him with another player, you're paying him $1 million at least. So you're really not saving that much at the end of the day. Now, Devin Duvernay, take a look back over here one more time. He has essentially been paid part of his 2025 pay already, which is that nearly $2 million figure right here. And when you look at what he's earning this year, it's a little over $4 million. So it's a question to me probably if Devin Duvernay is your primary kick and punt returner. And if he's not, what value does he really bring to the team? It's sort of like Ronald Darby, where is he even going to get on the field for us? And do you want to pay a backup that much money? I have no problem if you're to keep that kind of player, just because it's not the end of the world. But I would like to see him start, ideally, as a return man if you're going to have him on the roster. Problem is, Parker Washington arguably was better this year. And to be fair, that is a somewhat good problem to have, even if it brings into question why you brought in a player like Devin Duvernay. Now, Andrew Wingard, he is going to be someone who most of this money is non-guaranteed at this point, so you could save a sizable amount moving on from him. If we take a look over here, you could save about $2.6 million this year, and then in 2026, you don't have any cap hits for him regardless, so this is really the figure that we're talking about him being worth. And I do think he's someone who's worth that, because we've seen when he's come into play for this team, which we've had a lot of injuries at safety, he's brought juice. He's been good on the field. He hasn't really been a bad player for Jackson. If he has to start, he could do fine at that. So that is valuable to me, especially at a position where we don't really have great players there right now, or at least there's question marks. And, Andre Cisco, probably the guy I feel like would have the highest ceiling in that group, but it doesn't even sound like he's going to be back at this point. Not much headway being made there, or conversations about contract negotiations going on. So just something to consider there. I think Andrew Wingard's a player that I would definitely keep on. Now, Logan Cook, last one we'll talk about here of potential cut candidates, and you could really get into the nitty-gritty, maybe mention a Luke Fortner. But for Logan Cook, he is essentially someone that, he doesn't have like $1 million cap hit for a special teamer, so you have to consider, is he really playing great? At the end of the day, Logan Cook is playing great for the Jaguars. He's been a Pro Bowler, and he's someone that I feel like you might as well keep around. Why create a problem for your team when it costs so little to have that player? Now, looking here, pretty much all of the money that's left on his contract is non-guaranteed. It's just like $80,000 that you would pay him extra over his APY. Not a big deal. So Logan Cook, I would go ahead and just keep him around this year. It's a question of, is he worth like 2.9? And absolutely he is. He's played well for the Jaguars, so why create that problem? Now, we've shown this tab a few times here. Why I built this is essentially giving you an idea of what it looks like if you were to just cut all these players, save as much money as you can. We're not including trades here, which maybe you do something like I mentioned with Gabe Davis, where you throw a pick in, try to just get rid of the contract, which I would really be on board for, but just don't think it's super realistic or something they're considering. This tab is essentially going to tell you, if they cut everyone, how much are they underspending at that point. So you would have 35 players on the roster plus another 10 from your rookie pool. So this is 45 players. You'd have to add in 8 more to get to the 53-man roster. And then you would also have your practice squad. So all of that combined, adding that in, you're probably adding $12 million to what you're spending per year. And as of now, before that $12 million, you are $41 million under when we're talking about what money are you given to spend and what is the average cost of each player at this point in their contract. So if we add that all together, you're $29 million in the direction you want to go. Now, that is also considering you're cutting Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, Devon Hamilton, Mitch Morse, Devin Duvernay, Andrew Wingard, and Logan Cook. So you have some needs if you're doing that. You're going to have to spend to address some of those needs because you might not be able to fix a lot of those problems in the draft. So there is the flip side to that as well. But I think ultimately the point we want to get across here is that the Jaguars, they have opportunities to save money, but from the point they're starting at, they are essentially already spent up to what they should be spending per year. Now, if they want to spend extra for this season because, well, let's just ignore that we have a Gabe Davis under contract or a Ronald Darby, not Ronald Darby, a Darnell Savage, maybe players that you aren't in on for the long term if you're Liam Cohen and whatever GM comes in. Maybe you ignore that and just say, hey, that's a loss. We're still going to spend like normal on other players. And so maybe this figure ends up being more to the negative just for this year. That's totally acceptable if that's the route they go. But for right now, they are essentially already lined up with what they should be spending. You have opportunities to move on from players, but most of them that really give you any legitimate amount of savings, because really, like, I think the most you get from all these other players is what, the $4.3 million from Devon Hamilton. That's not a lot of money. The guys you have to move on from are starter and Christian Kirk in the slot, which you could replace with Parker Washington, right? That's an option. That would be probably the most cost-effective saving measures you could have. But you also have Evan Ingram here, which, well, I mentioned that Brendan Strange may be more of a fit. Evan Ingram is just a better player. And even if he's playing in a kind of different role, more as a blocker, I still think he's more valuable than Brendan Strange. It just comes down to what are they getting paid per year? Because there's such a huge discrepancy between that you have to say maybe Evan Ingram might not be worth what he would be getting paid this year. So you're really looking at two players that can save you a lot of money. And if you move on from those players, you're opening up holes on the roster, right? That's very debatable. So that's something to consider here. But the good thing is if they're just going to look at it from this year's perspective, you do have a lot of cap space available. You get different numbers, but generally, you're looking at something like 50, 60 million for this team. And if you take that, you're going to be able to make some moves in free agency. You could get some players in here, but you got to be smart about your spending because the way this team has been structured, you're already pretty much there as far as using up the resources you're being given by the NFL each season. So, with that said, I am going to wrap it up there. I know this is kind of like a more confusing video, but I think it's important to bring in that context and really explain those things because they don't get mentioned enough. And when we just look at this each year from a one-year perspective, what ends up happening is you don't realize the consequences of maybe keeping a player. And then you're on the hook next year for that, and you're not in a good situation. So you want to keep in mind not just 2025, but what's going to happen in the years to come. And ultimately, to me, regardless of what cap hits are, it's always a question of what is the player slated to earn this year and are they really worth that at the end of the day. So that's just how I feel about it. But I think it's definitely a different way you can look at it. So with that said, want to shout out our channel members. Want to shout out our channel members really quick. Premier Series 904, Nightmare Eco, Gator John Bites, Scrubber Ducky 500, Frangies, and Brian Foster. I appreciate all your support. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Definitely let me know what you think, your personal thoughts. What would you do regarding the Jaguars and free agency? We'll take a look at maybe some of the players they could sign soon. And then, of course, the NFL Combine comes up next week. So we'll be watching that very closely. So appreciate y'all being here. Have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.